I'm very pleased to welcome you on this occasion of our first, this is our first edition of an online Castle Talk on cross-border cooperation. We used to, let me just say a few words in introduction. We used to organize these meetings once a semester in Strasbourg at the Château Porte à l'Est. It's a cooperation with the SIPA Foundation, which have a study abroad program for American students, and some master programs of the University of Strasbourg, Sciences Po Strasbourg, the Master of International Relations, and the master also of Frédéric Béraud, my colleague here, on health issues, on legal health issues. And normally we meet 2 days in this nice surroundings of the chateau. And the idea is to have students and researchers exchange on a topic in relation with borders and European integration. This is done in a framework of a Jean Monnet project, which is called Crisis, European Crisis and Border Regions. And we have already organized 3 Castle talks so far on different crises, one on Euroscepticism, one on the crisis of les ressentiments, one on the Schengen crisis, and the last one on the migration crisis was scheduled in March 2020, just before the lockdown. We wanted to keep it up right until the very end, but then the American students were leaving in a rush because Donald Trump had announced that they would close the borders. And then the borders also closed between France and Germany. And in the end, we couldn't do the Castle Talk. So the idea was to have a second try, and we tried again. And today and tomorrow was the second try of the migration Castle Talk. And there was the second lockdown. And so we could not, as we thought, organize this Castle Talk, this meeting in the chateau. And so we decided to divide it into 2 sections. One section of the round table, I'm very pleased that the panelists, or some of the panelists for the round table, which will start at 6:30, are already here, of distinguished professors, specialists on the question, who talk about a subject in relation with the migration crisis, and our subject is the effects of COVID-19 on the migration crisis. This was the idea, to keep this upright and allow for an exchange with American students, American colleagues via the online facilities, via Zoom. And the second idea was to not completely let drop the possibility of students to be able to exchange. And so we wanted to have a kind of test session, the first hour from now to 6:30, with students, which is kind of an aperitif for what we are going to do in extenso on 18th of January, when we will try again to do the Castle Talks, if possible, en présentiel, but if not, we will do it online. So the first hour now, I have chosen among the 11 groups that are working on the issues of migration, the migration crisis and borders, from the university, from Sciences Po Strasbourg, and from the Faculty of Law in the University of Strasbourg. I have chosen 2 groups who have volunteered to make a small presentation, and of course not all the members of the groups can present, so 2 students of each group will present. And then our idea with my colleague Laura Hastings from Georgia State University was to have each time 2 students from Georgia State University in Atlanta making comments on their presentations, and so enable us to have at least a small student discussion during 1 hour. All the other students, we have 190 online registrations. All the other students from the Master of International Relations and the Faculty of Law are should be connected by now and are listening. They can ask, you can all ask questions, make comments via chat. Marc-Antoine here from the Center of Excellence and the Frontem network is going to monitor the chats and the questions. But let me now right away give the floor to the first group of Sciences Po. They are from my Master on Border Studies, and they have decided to work on the issue of the hotspots in Greece. And it's two girls, Clémence and Juliane, who are going to present their work, which they will present then more extensively on the 18th of January. Clémence and Juliane, you have the floor, and you can now click on Partager l'écran in order to show also your PowerPoint.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to share it right now if it works. Mm-hmm. Okay, do you see it?
It's coming.
Okay, so
Yes.
I think it's coming.
Sorry for the wait.
It was
Here.
yes, there it is.
Yes.
Everything is fine.
It's working.
Okay, go ahead.
So I think I will start. Hello, everybody. I'm Clemens, and I'm going to present you our work on the Greek hotspots with my friend Julian. So today our presentation will focus on the Greek hotspots, especially the ones located on Lesbos Island. If we have decided to work on the subject, that is because it's a real problematic regarding the ongoing European refugee crisis. And it can also enable us to reflect upon the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on migration. If we could cover a variety of topics of the EU refugee crisis, we have decided to focus our work on the case of Greece's hotspot and their evolution from registration and identification centers for asylum seekers to detention camp for illegal immigrants. And we're going to see that. So here is our outline. After a short introduction, we have divided our work into three parts. The first one recalls what are the political and legal challenges surrounding the EU common asylum policy. And the second one is a case study of the biggest refugee camp in Greece, the Moria camp. And finally, the third part focuses on the increasing role of NGOs on the ground, especially. So we will end then the debate with some questions in order to discuss migration from a French-American perspective. So yeah, we can start. First, it may be interesting to remind what is a hotspot. According to EU law, a hotspot is a reception center that has been implemented in frontline member states like Italy and Greece in order to identify and fingerprint migrants and refugees. So as you can see on the PowerPoint, we are especially going to focus on the set of islands that are near Turkey. Indeed, as more and more refugees are fleeing their countries of origin to come to Europe, the EU has decided to set up these hotspots that could help manage the unprecedented migratory flows. And then we can, about the contradictions of the EU common asylum policy, we have noticed that over the years, EU cooperation has truly increased regarding the asylum system, and the Union has never been more prepared and equipped to control migration. For instance, since 2005 and the creation of the Frontex agency, the EU has been fighting against smuggling and human trafficking of migrants taking place at Europe's external borders. And this is something that is interesting because the control of external frontiers is all the more important since the internal frontiers of the EU are regulated by the Schengen area, so meaning the free movement of goods, capital, and people. However, it seems that the refugee crisis that started in 2010 has questioned the Schengen ideal and has revealed the absence of proper policies and legal routes for migrants and refugees seeking shelter in Europe. Refugees are thus obliged to cross illegal and dangerous routes in order to come to the European continent, and often by risking their lives. So what is the EU doing about it? What about the status of asylum seekers and the protection of human rights? How the establishment of these hotspots in Greece can serve as a case in point to illustrate the numerous contradictions of this EU common asylum policy. Well, the role of these centers is to help EU countries sort out asylum seekers eligible for relocation, and also to see those whose application will be examined by the authorities or those whose application will be rejected. However, there are persistent debates between EU member states about the precise role of these centers. Are they reception places responsible for implementing the relocation of persons entitled to refugee status? Or are they places of detention for irregular migrants awaiting deportation? The problem of these hotspots is also that some countries, such as Italy and Greece, are undergoing much more pressure than other member states. And this can create a tense political climate. So that was, yes, this is a picture of a demonstration in Greece, for instance. And this, yes, that's fine. As we are students specializing in border studies, it was very interesting to mention the dispute taking place at the border between Greece and Turkey. So as you can see, most of the Greek hotspots are located on the set of islands next to Turkish borders. So then I think we can go on with the case study. Yes. So this is an example of one of the hotspots in Greece. It was set up in 2015. It's called the Moria camp, and it's based on the island of Lesbos. It represented the biggest refugee camp in Europe. And if I say represented, that's because it recently burned. But it was originally planned to host around 3,000 migrants, but facing an out-of-control situation, it ended up receiving more than 20,000 refugees. So if we have decided to use the Moria camp as an example, that is because it encompasses, we think, a lot of European and global challenges, whether it's in terms of politics, law, economics, human rights, or health. So yes, I think I will give the floor now to my friend to talk about the fire and the role of NGOs. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Clémence. So now I want to finish on the topic of the Moria camp with the fires that broke in Moria last September, at the beginning of September 2020. Indeed, a serious fire broke out in a number of spots in the camps, and the majority of migrants who were living there had to move out. This dramatic event shed light on the humanitarian emergency and the living conditions of the refugees in the camp, while questioning the union's ability to deal with it. Truth is, for now, the union cannot manage its migration crisis without external help, which it has found in NGOs, a state of fact that points to Europe's inner fragility. Inside what is now considered Europe's shameful camps, NGOs are the one to provide basic human needs to refugees. So you can see here pictures in the presentations of a center called the Pick Pass Center where NGOs helped refugees with, as you can see, food assistance, sanitary equipment, legal support, psychological support, and educational activities. Because for many of refugees who have been left behind, NGOs represent their only relief. And since the European Union has not done enough or hasn't got the capacity to help as much as it wants to do, the NGOs have taken over. The PICPA Center you see here has been even referred by some as a heaven for refugees, but last September, as we said, with the fires that broke out in the Moria camp, the Greek government wanted to restrict conditions for refugees in the country and are now shutting down every camp. So the PICPA Center exists no more. So yeah, the authorities try to push away as many refugees as they can off their coast by criminalizing NGOs. Some speaker on the issue, as Panagiote Dimitras, the spokesperson for the Greek Helsinki Monitor, has expressed his indignation in regards to those politics. And moreover, those actions aren't successful since refugee flows have not stopped. But with the criminalization of NGOs and the shutting down of centers, NGOs are in a kind of a paradox, as I explained in the PowerPoint. Indeed, they face a double challenge. They embody what should be expected from the European institution while being criminalized by doing so. It is a paradox that involves the EU's responsibility in the matter, since in fact the Union let NGOs grow into a role it did not wish to fill in the first place. Those hotspots illustrate Europe's leeway and question its capability to respond adequately to humanitarian disasters such as this one. So that is why I want to talk about the situation we are now in between cooperation and opposition and the future we can foresee. For now, we saw that it is more of an opposition between every level and every organizations, but there are some type of cooperations, notably between NGOs. So that is why I wanted to talk about the Aquarius, which is a boat run by NGOs such as MSF, which was a boat dedicated to save refugees stranded at sea. However, it was seized in 2018 because no European members wanted to issue a flag for it to sail. But the project lived on thanks to another boat called the Ocean Viking, and then it was seized last month by the Italian government. So we can see there is a failure of the European members that are trying, as Vicky Hawkins, the executive director of MSF, said, they are trying to sabotage the human rights, the NGOs' attempts to save refugees at sea. So this situation proves the discordance at every level in the European Union between the local authorities in Greece and the local NGOs in Greece, and between the bigger NGOs such as MSF and the institution and European members. So that's why I wanted to aim at the need for a global discussion, because what we learn from all of this is that the action of NGOs are efficient, and so there are efficient solutions out there, and that it only needs a global discussions to reconcile every point of view and maybe help efficiently for the future refugees in those hotspots. Because solutions are possible and activism is still necessary. So to conclude rapidly, and then we'll go on with the questions that you may have, Europe's migration crisis could reveal itself as an EU crisis because lack of communication, lack of means, and a crisis between each EU member's philosophy are facts that could partly explain the humanitarian disaster that we face today. However, this situation is not unique, and images of migrant children taken away on the US-Mexico border has struck similar conversations on human migrants and migrants' rights. Eventually, it questions how the international community manages this so-called migrant crisis. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Can you stop just faire la partage d'écran?
Pardon? Je vous entendais pas au début.
Just stop the partage d'écran.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Okay, now we have already some reactions from the participants, but before this, I will give the floor to the two students from Georgia State University, Mordechai, and I don't know whether I pronounce your name correctly, and Sarah. Are you there, both of you?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so you have the floor. I don't know how you, if each of you intervenes one after the other.
Sarah's going to go and then I will go.
Okay, go ahead, Sarah.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sarah. You've met my partner, Mordecai. Thank you, both Clemence, Julian, for the presentation. I prepared a few comments based on the abstract. But first, yeah, I'm from Georgia State University in Atlanta. And let's get into it. So the topic of today's entire talk was the immigration crisis. Immigration is a problem. It's an issue that's been going on since states had borders. It's dated back as far then. People move for any number of reasons. They move for war, for natural disasters, to seek better lives. And we've been dealing with our own in the United States, but this one in Greece, nearly 6,000 miles away, is a little more complicated for matters that you mentioned. Each country has its own unique challenges, and Camp Moria in particular, like you mentioned, is the largest in Greece. It's the largest in the European Union, and it's put a great deal of strain on it. And the strain is absolutely political, as you pointed out. It's not just a humanitarian crisis. It involves states, it involves governments, it involves NGOs, like you said. So something else that's been going on in Europe right now is a resurgence of nationalism. This is relatively new. It's rejection of globalization. We can see this in Brexit. And I think in your presentation, when you mentioned Greece is trying to push away new refugees, they're clearly overwhelmed, but do you think that this has anything to do with nationalism? And I'd be curious to hear your ideas as to how this refugee crisis relates to nationalism and whether or not Greece might turn away from their obligations. So that also touches on the paradox that you mentioned. The paradox being that the EU has this obligation, that they want to help these people. However, they're pulling away, they're criminalizing the work of NGOs. These are two opposites we're dealing with. And I think part of this might even be coming from Greece's past. They've had financial troubles. They might not be well equipped to handle these refugees. There was the Eurozone debt crisis in 2010. They were bailed out, but there might have been lasting effects from that. I'm curious, in your research, did you come across anything that had any ties to that, as far as Greece's financial state and their inability to handle this many people? That also, I think you mentioned the inner fragility of the European Union. This, of course, would also be representative of that, just that they're not working in concert as they should be, despite all those organizations that they formed, all those agreements that they had. And of course, there's the issue of the camps themselves where Moria burned down. The other camps are facing massive overcrowding, sickness, disease, particularly with the virus right now. Do you think that at any point the United Nations might get involved? Both are NGOs, United Nations and the European Union, but it's a matter of, I don't know, like, did you come across any human rights violations that might necessitate a higher authority being involved? Particularly to do with the coronavirus, and that's what my partner Mordecai is going to talk about.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all for your presentation. So I'm studying computer science and economics, which may have a little bit of the influence on my questions. I'm curious about how Europe, specifically in the hotspot zones, has been collecting coronavirus data and how it's been presenting that coronavirus data. We know that politicians can talk a lot about how they feel about migration and settlement of refugees, but data doesn't lie. So how has the coronavirus data been included as part of the broader data set for the rest of Europe? Is it a line item that says, this is the Greece's daily totals today, and here are the refugee daily totals for Greece, or is it all included in the same bundle? I think that might give a better idea and a better focus as to how the EU is actually feeling about the refugee crisis, because they may talk a great talk, but when it boils down to it, how are they actually tabulating things? To follow up a little bit on the resurgence of nationalism, how has the fire, the fire in the Moria camp happened in September, so in the midst of the coronavirus crisis, how has the movement of those refugees to other camps intersected, I would say, with the general rise in nationalism? One of the core tenets of I guess more violent nationalism is the finding of an other, to point out that this is us and that's the other, and refugees unfortunately are prime targets for being the other in that type of situation. So how has the movement of migrants during the coronavirus crisis interplayed with the rise in nationalism throughout Europe? And then just a broader question having to do with Greece's financial crisis. What do you think that, Greece and Italy both have this large responsibility, which in some sense can be used as a negotiating tool, saying, we bear the brunt of responsibility for the migrant crisis. What are you going to do for us, as it were? So what, if anything, has Greece been relating their financial crisis to their acceptance of refugees? And finally, as European residents, how do you feel about the migrant crisis? There's a lot of statistics and a lot of numbers and a lot of ideas here. But how do European residents, I guess it ties in a little bit with the nationalism idea, but how do you as European residents feel about this? Again, thank you so much, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much for your excellent questions. There are a lot of them, and I would like to give back the floor to Clémence and Juliane to answer what you can. And I know it was a lot in a short time, but that's the whole idea about a discussion on a subject that you researched on.
Yes, it was a lot of questions, but this was very, very interesting. First,
thank you very much for the feedback.
I'm sorry?
Yes, I said thank you very much for the feedback. Sorry, my connection isn't working very, very well.
That's fine. I think, yes, I can start on the question of nationalism. I think what Sarah, you said, and it's clear that the migration crisis has been instrumentalized by political leaders in Europe. As you can see with Brexit, or in other countries like Hungary, you have political leaders who definitely used the migrant crisis to build a kind of nationalist and sometimes xenophobic parties. So yeah, I feel like this migrant crisis, which consists initially of a massive influx of migrants and refugees at the gates of Europe, so only in a technical way you could say, has transformed into a political and a social problem, which paved the way to identitarian closure and the return of borders. So yeah, that's definitely something that is important to talk about nationalism. And Greece also is, I think, tired, less like Italy, to have all the pressure into 2 European countries while you have so many other possibilities. So yeah, that's my opinion on nationalism, but I don't know if you want to add something, Julian.
You want to add something?
Yes. I'll take on after that. I don't know if it's really tied with nationalism, but I wanted to talk about the expression of the inner fragility. The main problem the European Union is the lack of social common goal. The social ideal of a true European identity has not been reached since the beginning of the creation of the European Union, and I think it is what mostly lack in this situation, because we cannot have a common stance on the migration crisis, and so because we can't have this common idea or stance, it is why we have nationalism that rise in some countries, such as Hungary, as Clemence said, or that there is not enough solidarity between these. We have to remind that Greece and Italy, and I don't know it is, but we have also to think about how the pressure is put through, notably after the economic crisis of 2008. So yeah, I think that we lack as European of a common ideal that could benefit the refugees that are trying to find a refuge and a better life here. I don't know if Clemence said.
Thank you. We had a little bit of connection problems, but I think it was okay. Let me just.
Sorry.
Yeah, but I think we got the most of it. I think we will have to move to the second group, but before this, let me just add one point on the nationalism, because this goes back to the question of has the COVID crisis or the Moria camp, which burned down, increased nationalism in Europe. I think the rise of nationalist or xenophobic behavior has not been born with this. It has been, and this it has started much earlier. It has started much earlier, probably very soon after the 2015 migration crisis. This was a starting point for a rise of populism or xenophobia with regard as a reaction to the migration crisis. And the Moria camp is just another element in this. Let me also maybe just give the floor very briefly to my colleague Frédéric Béraud, because you had a question on data, and I think she has some information on this, how the data, because that's a very interesting question, how the data is collected on COVID-19 and how that is, or is there a coordination or not in the European Union? Very good question. Frédéric.
Thank you.
I'm not a specialist, but from what I read, it's difficult to have to say that we have a systematic collection of data in the migration camps. Apparently, when we have the fire in Moria, we had some clusters of migrants infected by the COVID-19, and we have a certain number of figures. I don't know if they are systematic, but we have, let's say, since September, a certain number of figures. I think it's largely underestimated, but maybe it's my own feeling, and it's an important subject. I think one of the difficulties that we do not have a common approach, even in Europe, of how to count the people infected or dying from the COVID-19. We began to do so, but it's the very beginning. So I think that's part of the answer.
Thank you, Frédéric.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for the 4 students. I think this was an excellent first discussion. And let's move now to the second group to give the same time to the second group, which has worked, Dylan and Jean-Christophe, who have worked on the externalization of migration in Europe. And I give the floor to Dylan and Jean-Christophe, if you want to share your screen. Are you still with us?
Yes, I'm working on it.
It may take just 2 or 3 seconds to.
Yeah.
Yeah, there it is. That's perfect. Okay, you have the floor, Dylan.
So
it's,
it will be me who start the presentation. So first of all, good evening to all. Today, our topic will be the externalization of European borders, which is another aspect of the European migration crisis compared to the first group. So first of all, in the introduction, we are going to mention the geographical context of the situation, and we will see the definition of externalization. And in the first part, we will see how this policy was originated and how it evaluated in history. And in the second part, we'll see how it muted after the Arab Spring influence, and finally the conclusion. So let's get started. Well, as you can see on the map, European continent benefits from a strategic geographical location, which means easy access to the African continent in the south and to the Asia in the east. However, this advantage may also be a problem in terms of instability in its neighboring countries, which could result in human movement, which we call migration to the continent. Indeed, since the signing of the Schengen Agreement in 1985, European countries have progressively switched from a national focus migration policy to a shared competence with the European Union, which means a common border control of the Schengen area, as highlighted in red on the map. And as the phenomenon of migration are skyrocketing, the EU could no longer handle the situation, and thus it proceeds to an externalization of its migration policy. So next part, we would see, what does externalization mean? Well, according to Dale Baratti, a researcher in European policy, it means pushing an activity out of one's own establishment and entrusting it to a subcontractor in return for payment. To put it in one word, it means a country or an organization which delegates its authorities over a certain policy to a third country and give it support, financial or material. So how is this externalization implemented exactly? EU's external action on migration management can be categorized into two mechanisms. On one hand, they try to block migrants in a third country and leave this country the management of the migrants. And on the other hand, EU since the Treaty of Readmission, which allows EU to send back the irregular migrants they call illegal to its original country. However, for each area, EU uses different policy instruments, cooperation methods, as well as incentives in order to ensure compliance and the transfer of its policy to non-member states, which are also called the third countries. And let's begin with the first part, when we'll see how this policy is originated. And I'll give the micro to my colleague Dylan.
Okay, thank you. So throughout the last 2 decades, 3 different narratives can clearly be distinguished regarding EU migration policy. And this part will highlight the geopolitical and socio-economic environment in which those objectives emerged and how they have reflected on the EU policy regarding migration. So migration is traditionally framed as an economic and social issue. Fear is that labor markets would be unable to absorb migrants, creating unemployment. And the lack of integration also appears as an issue. It is the vision that we witnessed about EU enlargement toward Central Europe in 2004, which here you have on the map. And what you can notice is that in 2004, EU expanded its borders to region of transit and migration source countries such as Ukraine or Romania. Okay, so you have also in 2001 the terrorist attack in the US, as well as the attacks in Madrid and London, and because of that, migration issues were shifted from the so-called low politics to high politics related to state security. At the same time, the boundaries between internal and external security have become blurred owing to the increasingly transboundary nature of new security issues, such as organized crime or terrorism. And however, the narratives weren't all negative, and migration was also seen as an opportunity, even a necessity. And some scholars, such as Andrew Geddes, have highlighted that changes in labor market, population, and welfare states have played a significant role in shaping the external dimension of EU action. The European Commission estimated that by 2050, 33% of EU population will be over 65, which implies having 2 retirees for every active person, as a consequence of low birth rates and an aging population. Therefore, additional workforce will be needed to finance the shrinking social security system. This combination of various challenges and opportunities in the area of migration and mobility can be seen in different approaches the EU implemented before the Arab Spring. So, for example, in 2005, EU attempted to develop a common migration and asylum policy called the Global Approach to Migration, GAM. It acknowledged that the fight against illegal migration flows was no longer the only priority, and that migration development would be now placed on an equal footing, and that's at least politically. We can also notice that in the Commission paper that the Commission was publishing, we can see the stress on the terminology of management instead of control. It reflects inside the Commission a shift from a purely security-related approach to somehow global one. But at the same time, the Commission decided to implement maximum surveillance and control at EU borders as part of the EU counter-terrorism strategy. And the gathering of data by intelligence, the use of biometrics, and the creation of large databases became indispensable. The Arab Spring, however, led to a big shift, and the Arab Spring and the financial crisis as well changed the geopolitical and socio-economic situation. Indeed, as a result of the Arab Spring and Syrian civil war, oh, sorry, I forgot to change my PowerPoint, my slide. As a result of the Arab Spring and the Syrian civil war, illegal border crossing increased at the EU border, with most migrants being detected in the central Mediterranean area. Okay, so I have figures here on those graphs. Those figures are from Frontex, which I will explain later. The number of illegal border crossing has increased after 2013. It can be seen after the beginning of the Syrian civil war. Okay. So, as well, due to the severe effects of the global financial crisis, the labor market in EU member states shrunk. Unemployment rates have been felt in every EU country, although the severity varies widely between countries and sectors, such as health, science, or technology. And finally, the terrorist attacks across EU have pushed as well for stronger measures in terms of surveillance and control. EU adapts to this new international context. In 2011, a revision of the global approach to migration and mobility, and the emphasis on development appears to have shifted toward promoting legal migration from third country, in order this time to contribute to the development of EU economy and labor market, rather than aiming to reduce the root causes of migration. We can also notice an increased use of coercive measures and surveillance technology, as well as the development of an improved system of coordinated actions under the umbrella of Frontex. Moreover, since 2016, Frontex has the right to intervene in member states overwhelmed by migrants influxes, and its budget and staff have drastically increased since the onset of the refugee crisis. This being said, I'd like to look at the effective policies that EU implemented, and that's actually a work in progress that we will present in January during the Castle Talk, where we aim to compare migration policy toward Turkey and Morocco. And now it's my colleague who is going to conclude.
Well, so to conclude, what are the consequences of this policy? There are 3 points. First of all, the strengthening and the militarization of border security has led to an increase in the death toll among the migrants because these measures tend to push migrants towards more dangerous migration routes. For example, in 2017, there was 1 death for every 57 migrants crossing the Mediterranean. However, in 2015, that figure was 1 in 267. And secondly, the number of migrants did not decrease. As we can observe in the last graphs, it has instead increased since 2013, and especially in a more legal and dangerous way. Certainly, there was a bending around 2017 or 18, and this is the last point of the conclusion, which is that more and more migrants are being held in detention centers in third countries, where they suffer frequently from violence, mistreatment, or even human trafficking. We would like to remind the fact that the vast majority of the 35 countries considered priority by the EU for this policy of externalization are ruled by authoritarian regimes, which are known for their human rights violations and the low human development indicators. So by collaborating with these countries, EU could infringe the international law. For example, the Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which I quote, "No person should be subjected to measures such as refusal of admission at the border, or if he has already entered a territory in which he is seeking asylum, expulsion, refoulement to any state where he risks being the victim of persecution." Well, we can conclude that nevertheless, congratulating the decrease of the number of migrants coming to Europe since 2017 and both the success of this policy, European Union seems to have chosen to turn a blind eye into this situation. And this is our presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Can you stop sharing the screen as well? And thank you very much for this presentation, which you said was work in progress. So you're going to do 2 more case studies on Turkey and Morocco for January. That's very good. I would like to give the floor right away to Gennaro and Jack, who are going to comment on your presentation.
All right. How you doing? I'm Jack Landers. My partner and I, we're from Georgia State University here in Atlanta, Georgia. And thank you for the excellent presentation, Dylan and Jean-Christophe. We just have a few questions about the presentation and then externalization in general. And so the first question I have for you, here in the United States, we employ a similar method of externalization. Rather than using Turkey or Morocco, we use Mexico to kind of prevent Latin American and South American immigrants from coming into the U.S. Excuse me. And we experience pretty much the same issues here. It's a very dangerous crossing. It forces people to do it illegally. And my question is, why do we rely on these second world countries and developing countries to handle problems which we as first world countries can barely handle ourselves? And I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Gennaro, here.
Hey, how are you guys doing? Like Jack said, my name is Gennaro, and I'm a student at Georgia State. I am studying global studies. And one of the questions that I had for the presentation is going to be referring to security background, something that you guys mentioned. You guys stated that terrorist attack in the U.S. Occurred on September 11, 2001, and the subsequent terrorist attack in Madrid in 2004, in London in 2005. Migration issues were shifted from a so-called low politics to a so-called high politics related to state security. So one of the things that I was wondering if you guys could explain this a little bit more, because it seems as if you guys are connecting terrorism and immigration with the refugees. Here in the States, we've done lots and lots of studies that clearly show that there is a very, very, very low percentage of immigrants and refugees who are actually committing crime. And according to World Relief Seattle, there has not been one American life that's been lost due to an act of terrorism by someone who's a refugee here in the States. Another thing that I have a question about is, as you guys presented, one of the things that was going on in my head, I was wondering, who are you guys representing? Are you guys representing the EU? Are you guys representing the immigrants or the refugees? I just wanted a little bit of clarification on that, to kind of understand a little bit of where you guys are coming from. And then also regarding to the legal framework, you guys stated that there was a need for revision for the global approach to migration and mobility to respond to changing international context. My question here is, what is the goal of this entire presentation? What is the goal for you guys? What are you guys trying to accomplish by presenting this? And if there was a revision made to the global approach to migration mobility, how would that change your perspective, or how would that change how you guys present or deliver the presentation that you did today? So I just want to say thank you again, and I look forward to your responses.
Thank you very much. There again, we have quite a lot of questions, and I give the floor right again back to Dylan and Jean-Christophe. If you want to answer.
So on the first question, if I understand well, it's why European countries put confidence in the third countries while they can barely control this migration. That I would say, because in the internal European continent is just a little bit suffocated from these migrations, so that European Union try to enlarge the geographical space in order to contain this amount of migrants, especially after our Arab Spring in 2011. And that's my answer to the first question. And for the second question, well, as we have mentioned in the last presentation, the migration has been largely instrumentalized for the terrorism by some parties. So I think for the political purpose, this is inevitable that we take a more coercive measure in order to take control of the situation. And finally, the goal of this presentation is to take a neutral role, and we try to be critical, be neutral compared to this policy, and try to find its flaws as well as the points that we can improve on. Thank you.
Dylan?
So can I answer? Yeah, I'll start by the last question actually, because Jean-Christophe was saying we were trying to take a neutral role. I would say that what I was presenting is more the perspective of the Commission actually, and the different narratives that the Commission, or it was actually based on the literature that we found and how it had been conceptualized by the Commission, and we wanted in our comparison between Turkey and Morocco to look actually to take a look at how those narratives reflect on the policies that have been implemented. So it was not neutral in a sense that that second part is not trying to be neutral. It's just trying to take a look at the different narratives that the Commission was using. And as well, and again, it answers to the question, to the link between terrorism and migration, because I would not say the Commission was doing that, but some narratives were actually establishing a link here. So that's just what we tried to do to show you what the different narratives were.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for the answers. Maybe if I may just add one or two things on the link between terrorism and migration. Why do we have this link? I think the link has clearly been established at the moment of the migration crisis in Europe, which was in 2015. It was created when Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, decided to let in migrants. And it was at the same time when France was hit by a number of terrorist attacks. So in the media, in fact, these two crises, in fact, were mixed up. And so I think in the end, some of the media and some of the political parties, as Dylan probably referred to as well, it was in the end put in a way that the migrant is forcibly the bad terrorist. So the two are the same, and this is probably a European phenomenon because we had these two crises at the same time. For the externalization, I think what you have to also take into account is that we are working in the master on a more extensive presentation in January, and externalization, I mean, here we had two phenomena. We had the secularization of borders, which is, not letting people come in from outside. It's building fences and walls, a little bit like you do in the States with Mexico as well. But there is the other question of the deals, the treaties with Turkey, also with the Mediterranean states, Tunisia, Morocco, and this is a little bit different. It's like Jean-Christophe has said, it's looking for keeping the migrants outside of the territory of the European Union, or when dealing with Tunisia or Morocco, is trying to find deals to avoid them to try and cross the Mediterranean. So these are this is a little bit different, and I think these two both elements were in the presentation, but will be still further developed by the students for January. Thank you very much for all 8 students here. I think it was an excellent discussion on two very important questions, and it was a very good introduction, in fact, of our roundtable. So let me now invite the students to now listen to the specialists of these questions, and we will have a small change in our panel because my colleagues Joachim Beck from the Hochschule Kehl and Frédéric Béraud will take over for the moderation of this roundtable. I would like to just introduce to you the panelists. Lauren Hastings, are you now connected? I see you on the screen. Everything is fine. You can hear us. You can you can put on perfect. Okay. Then we have Lady Bianco. So Lauren Hastings is my colleague from Georgia State University, who I've already met in Atlanta, and we are collaborating together with SIPA, and it was her idea to have the American students come into this discussion online. It was an excellent idea, Laura. I think we can do that again. It was perfect. Then we have Lady Bianco, who is a former judge at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and also an associate professor at the Faculty of Law. Lady, are you with us? Yes.
Yep,
Okay,
right.
perfect. Just to
hear
make
you.
sure that everybody is here. Then we have Niklas Plätzer, who is a professor at Sciences Po Reims. This is a collaboration which was, in fact, initiated via the US Embassy here in Strasbourg, together with the CEPA Foundation. We had the idea to also invite students from Sciences Po Reims to our Castle Talks. So, Niklas, are you with us as well from Berlin?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, hello. And then we have Hank Edmondson. Hank, are you connected? Hank Edmondson is my colleague from Georgia College in Atlanta. He has been already presented. Hank, are you there? I think we are still missing Hank, but he'll probably join us a little bit later then. He promised to join us. Well, thank you very much for joining us for this panel discussion on the effects of COVID-19 on the migration crisis from a comparative US-EU perspective. And I will now leave the floor to my two colleagues for the moderation of this roundtable.
Thank you, Birte. So what I would propose, of course, we will also devote a little bit of time to answer the questions asked on the chat. So do not hesitate, of course, to participate and to ask questions. Maybe we will begin with the first statement by each of you. Would you say that the COVID-19 has led to a rebordering process, and how can you describe it? Maybe how can you describe it so that we understand if we have differences between the United States and the European Union or the European continent, or if it's the same phenomenon because it's the same pandemia, and so we have found more or less the same means to fight against the COVID-19 pandemia. So it's up to you to decide who will begin, maybe to begin with the European Union, and then we will maybe go to the United States, as one of our participants is still missing, so we will just leave him a little bit of time.
I mean, maybe I can, or Laurie.
Yes, please come in.
Okay, sorry. So first of all, thanks for this wonderful invitation and for this exciting event. I'm sad we can't be together to discuss in person. So let me just preface this by saying I come from political theory. So I'm a PhD student at the University of Chicago in political theory and a teaching fellow at Sciences Po Reims. And I think one of the things that political theory can contribute to this, beyond sort of the empirical question of what is going on with the management of migration in Europe or in the United States at the age of COVID, is first of all to question the categories that we use to describe it. So I just want to really caution us. A lot of talk in this conversation so far has made use of, I'm just going to quote here, the terms crisis, the term gates of Europe, states are being overwhelmed, or externalization of security measures are a result of suffocating member states. So here I really think that we're dealing with a type of, set of sort of concepts, that really put together this idea of the crisis as something that is inevitable, that is almost like a natural phenomenon, just like COVID. So that's, as a short response, I would just say what we see is this type of tethering, this type of linking of the language of the medical emergency and the language of the state of emergency and the state of siege that is, the political phenomenon of borders. So I really resist this language, of the migration crisis. I think it obscures more than it allows us to see. I think what it does is it sort of naturalizes this idea of the nation-state border regime. What we should be talking about is not the migration crisis, but the effects of bordering. So I just wanted to put that out there. And I think in that regard, we really need to be careful to also say that the COVID crisis is something natural. What the crisis itself is, first of all, a result of human-animal interaction, perhaps in the origins of the virus, but then also, of course, how the medical system operates, how the welfare state operates, and so on. So instead of naturalizing this category of the crisis as this event that is beyond control, let's look at the structures that produce these underlying mechanisms. So I'll just leave it at that as a first invitation to maybe question the language in which we frame it. And then I'm very happy to talk about more empirical issues as we move on.
So what is your feeling, Lady?
Well, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, if we go back to the origin of what we can call the migration crisis, I think the basic reason is a lack of solidarity, which has been already pointed out and underlined by many political representatives. Also, the European courts, both in Strasbourg and Luxembourg, they've raised this issue. I recall, for example, a separate opinion of my former Greek colleague in the case of MSS versus Belgium and Greece. Already in 2010, he said that the Dublin system, it's not a system which is based on solidarity. And this kind of lack of solidarity has gone along with the migration issues since then, especially with the height of the 2015 crisis, until now. And of course, it was mentioned as well by some of the students during the presentations that it has kind of fed the nationalistic approaches, nationalistic politics. With the COVID crisis, we have the doubling of these nationalistic concerns. What the COVID crisis does, to my understanding, is that European governments, even rich governments, are facing a big issue, for example, for testing their own nationals. So once the problem comes to test as well asylum seekers or migrants in general, this concern, these fears are doubled. Because then it comes the other issue, which is if we have positive cases against migrants, how we're going to deal with them, in what conditions we are going to deal with them. And these are legal obligations under the Dublin package, under the directive, reception condition directive. This is why what we see European states closing their borders for the European citizens is even more kind of delicate and even more problematic when they think of closing their borders for the asylum seekers as well, because in these cases their obligations are much more problematic. And I'll deal later with another legal issue which comes up in migration cases in the framework of the COVID crisis. But I'll leave the reaction to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What about the US perspective, Laura?
Hi, Niklas, it's nice to hear you're from Berlin. I have a son in Berlin who I haven't seen since December because of COVID. So my area of research is intra-Latin American migration. So I had hoped that my colleague would talk more about the US-Mexican border. But I second both of the points from Ledi and Niklas. First about this notion of crisis. I think that's really key here. This narrative that actually facilitates certain kinds of policies. You know, if you say something is a crisis, you can get away with things that you couldn't under normal policy routes. But I also was going to make the point about heightened notion of borders, because Latin America, sort of under the radar, has been known for accepting refugees and movements of people in a way very different from the US and Europe, offering migrants legal status and access to public services. It's really quite remarkable that it hasn't been spoken about more. Colombia, of course, most notably, but Argentina as well. And what's so interesting about Argentina is that in this case, since COVID-19, they have change this. So COVID-19 has allowed them to heighten this notion of their border in a way that we saw in Europe as well, and that they actually didn't have. It never occurred to them to do that. Well, yes, it did. It occurred to them, but they didn't have the political backing. They didn't have the participation. And now suddenly they're also closing their borders. So very interesting interaction of COVID-19 and regular migration or immigration policies.
Thank you. I think that our last participants to the roundtable is connected. What is your own feeling about this rebordering process, which has taken place first with the migration crisis, if we can speak about a crisis, which I think is a problem, and the COVID crisis, which is a bit more with a little bit more of emergency, if I may say so. What is your own feeling about this from an American perspective? Don't know if you hear us.
Hank?
No, first ask Harold until
Harold
joins in.
Harold Mook.
Okay, so Harold, if you have any comments, please come in.
Yep, forgive me, I'm joining unexpectedly, standing in for Hank. I'm sorry, just very quickly, would you repeat the question, please?
The COVID-19 has led to a rebordering phenomenon in the world. What is your own analysis of what is going on in the US?
So the question that you're asking, I think our panel so far, we've dealt with this a bit from a theoretical perspective. But one element that we have not considered is the, or at least not fully, is the role that borders play, I would say, in the American domestic imagination. And borders have been much more a part of our political discourse in the past 5 to 6 years. As something that is, as a means of excluding the constitutive other. So I think that some of the language that we have seen, certainly in the American domestic political context, particularly from the right, intimates that borders are meant to keep us safe, not only from other people, but also from what we imagine as threats. As I say that, I see that Hank has Dr. Hank
I see that also. So Hank, if you want to comment, do not hesitate. We'll try to discuss about the rebordering phenomenon, which is linked with the COVID-19, and maybe do you see? Is it for you the same border as the border we faced since 2015 in the European Union concerning the migration wave or so-called wave we had to face in the European Union? Do you think that you have a difference between a sanitary border and a border which is here to control migration? Switch on the micro because we don't hear you.
Hang the micro.
Yeah. Okay, there we go.
Thank you.
That should do it. Yeah, I was going to say I have been watching and listening, but apparently I was connected as not as a participant, but just as the audience. So sorry about that. Okay, let me try to respond to your question. I mean, you've phrased that question in a way that we don't really, or we don't articulate it that way. That's very much of a European articulation of the question of immigration. And I don't know if I can respond to it exactly. Let me try and I'll at least talk around it. first of all, I think the immigration crisis in Europe is far worse than anything that we've experienced. I think it's genuinely a crisis. I don't think we've had a crisis. We've had sharp policy disagreements here, and there are several dimensions to that. I know that Donald Trump is not your favorite American president, but one of the reasons that he was elected is because he spoke to something that other people weren't speaking to. I think it's often interpreted as a hostility to immigrants, a hostility to migrants, xenophobia and all that. And I don't doubt that some of that is there. But I think for the most part, he was expressing a concern that the previous administrations were not articulating to the satisfaction of the American public. And I think it's going to be really important to see whether the Democrats now understand why Trump was elected the first time and why he ran a very close election the second time. There are several dimensions to it. I mean, having said that, I don't think we have a crisis the way that you have a crisis. We have a political crisis. I think you've experienced a real crisis. In terms of what the pandemic has done over here, it's really just sort of kicked the can down the road a little bit. We just haven't been focused on that, and we haven't been talking about it. Trump leaves office with an unfulfilled promise. I mean, he built 400 miles of a wall on our southern border, but that's not going to do anything, nor will it be continued. It's an artifact at this point in time. It would have had some effect, but I think if you want to control the borders, you need more technology than you need physical structures, or at least a combination to those. I think the primary concern here for a long time has simply been the rule of law. What is our policy? What's legal and what's not legal? If we want to change things, then we need to change the law. So that's been the concern of a lot of people. The other is something that I think it can be hard for political elites to understand, and that's a concern over culture. And I think you've had some of that as well. I mean, as you know, we're a melting pot as much as any European country, more than many, and you are part of that. But at this point in time, people have worked hard to create a certain kind of culture, and I think people just want to be assured that the immigrants who are coming in are willing to assimilate into that culture. Unfortunately, we are beginning to promote a kind of a balkanization, a cultural balkanization in our own country. And so the question of assimilation, the question of, it's not to say that a culture can't evolve, that a culture is not dynamic, but we still believe that a culture is part of the strength of the nation. One last thing that I think has to be acknowledged, is not said as much as it should be, and that is that Hispanic immigrants anyway tend to vote Democratic. And now that is not as reliable as it used to be, as this last election shows. And so that factors in to the different positions that are taken by the two political parties. I think, and then the last thing I would say is a question of humaneness. Whatever we do, it has to be humane. And people who are already in our country have to be treated in a humane way. And that hasn't always been the case. Trump has been very clumsy with all of that. Now, one final thing: our strength is our pluralism. Germans, Irish have given us a great deal of strength. Hispanics now, they come in with a different sort of character, but as long as they have the opportunity to go to school and to work, they're a strength of our culture as well. So it's largely a matter of the process rather than the concept. And I'm sorry if I spoke too long there.
That's fine, thank you. May I add another question which is linked to the first question regarding a possible rebordering process? My question would be a bit broader. Just a weekend, I had a little bit of time for reading, and I was reading a nice book of Jürgen Elwert on the history of European integration, and he distinguished 3 phases: the creation, the reconciliation, and the third phases. But the book was published in 2005, was the Europeanization phases. And listening to our debate so far in the presentations, I wonder if he would not add a 4th phase, which is actually the crisis of the institution. Looking back to one element that the students mentioned, there was one rational response of the European institutions. That was the Blue Card Directive. That was a rational approach to how to make migration issues a bit more smarter and handle them in a more rational way. Then in 2015, with the migration challenge, this completely faded away. But it was still a sort of European response. When I look at the COVID-19 challenge, I would not call it crisis, I haven't seen any European response. So is there a tendency that the combination of migration and COVID challenges leads to, let's say, a weakening of an integration and throws us back to a logic of more intergovernmental cooperation? Because that is always these 2 big challenges when it comes to European integration, supranationalization, a real integration on the one hand, what we've been fighting for. And right from the beginning, there's this big challenge on the other hand, not to go further, but to keep it in a way to a more intergovernmentalist approach. And I'd like to ask this question first to Niklas, who draw on political science, which could give us answers. This is a very interesting, I think so, reflection. Intergovernmentalism as a response mechanism to all these crises.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in agreement with this. I think that it's definitely true that there has not been a type of effective supranational coordination or, an advancement of the European integration process to a type of new phase. But, that type of insight should help us question this sort of teleological understanding of development in the first place. Maybe the optimism was part of the problem. So, you can only get disappointed if you expected things to go differently. I personally think that one of the insights that, and I think in this, even though I'm in disagreement with some of the other things that Professor Edmondson just mentioned, what I think is right and what I think needs to be foregrounded both in the US and the European analysis is that the political progressives have, and myself, I would include myself in this group, have underestimated the stickiness of the national imaginary. And so this intergovernmental, turn of managing a challenge like this, a policy challenge, is also expressive just simply of the attachments that people continue to have with vis-a-vis the nation state, and which have not been able to be surpassed by something like a European sense of civicness. And so I think that what's really important to highlight is that we're not dealing, and I really think that's part of the problem, this idea of like there's a rise of nationalism, and in 2015 there was a crisis that happened, and then people turned nationalism, xenophobia, and so on. That's a type of like I think illusionist way of putting it. It's the nation state has been there all along, and the problem is there has not been an alternative way for creating civic attachments other than the nation state. And so technocracy on the one hand, and have a progressive management, potentially a welcoming policy, this type of technocratic progressivism on the one hand, and a right-wing backlash of nationalism, I think are 2 sides of the same coin. Because none of these, the nationalist imaginary on one hand, or a technocratic intergovernmentalism, actually allows for spaces where people can develop a sense of being European or a sense of being plurally American, acting together with plural others. It's a kind of reinforcement of a type of identitarian bubbles on both sides. On the one hand, it's the technocratic liberals who think that they're the progressive welcoming people, and on the other hand, there's a type of I would say obduracy of the nationalists who insists on sort of the value of the type of cultural tradition that's under threat. But instead of saying in the abstract, how do we get supranational institutions off the ground, I think we should ask, how can we, as citizens, and as potentially political actors, create spaces where these type of democratic attachments to other forms of institutions become a sort of lived reality. And that's the question that I think we're not asking enough. And I think that's the way that potentially the left in the United States could fight Trump, and the type of Trumpism that will still be his legacy, but also how in the European Union we can give something like a reality to a European Union that has been largely an elite project and which is continues to be disconnected. And then the intergovernmental policy situation today is just sort of the outcome of that.
If I may make two small points, Lady, if you don't mind, just to piggyback on. First of all, if you look at Latin America and the creation of a very poor model of European Union in Mercosur, the regional trade agreement, you will not see the demise of the nation state by any means. But what you do see is something very important, which is an imagining of a heightened understanding of what the other feels. And I think that is very important. And you see it obviously between France and Germany. I lived in France when I was young, and I now have ties to Germany. And the difference between the way in which these people feel about each other is very important. It doesn't diminish the strength of the nation state, but something has happened as a result of regional trade agreements, as a result of this kind of project. If I might just make one other point regarding this notion of culture. I think culture is a highly dangerous term. Again, as a political scientist, early on at MIT, I was told, don't ever use that word because it is whatever somebody wants it to be. And my fear is that the United States has seen itself in the last 4 years as culture is white people on top. Our culture is one in which Blacks don't have equal opportunity to get credit at a bank. Blacks don't have, or Black and brown people do not have equal opportunities to buy houses and live in certain parts of communities. And that is a culture that, that has been, that's been left with us, and we have not questioned it. And I think over the summer, the white supremacy has really been questioned, and that's really hard. It's really hard for even liberals to acknowledge. I enjoy having these benefits, and I know that is not part of this discussion. I just wanted to get that in. Thanks.
I'm lucky. I'm an administrative scientist, and I just talk about administrative organizational culture.
Thank you, Lady. You wanted to mention another legal problem in relation with the migration, and I also have a question. Do you see any differences in the management of borders between the first wave of COVID and the second one? Do you think that we have learn anything or nothing?
Let me, before moving to that, let me recall, because it was mentioned, the European integration, kind of history of European integration was mentioned. And this reminded me of the French initiative in 1952 of the then French Minister of Health, who proposed the European Community of Health.
Yeah.
And this was endorsed by the French government, if I'm not mistaken, September or October 1952, was introduced even formally by Robert Schuman in a conference. So the same way as he introduced the European Community on Coal and Steel, he introduced the European Community on Health. And during the first wave of the pandemic, I opened the old books that were given to us, Fred, in Bruges, and I was impressed. Since then, I haven't read this thing at all. I opened back books of, I don't know, 20, 25 years old, and then I realized that many of the objectives of this community were the ones the member states were seeking to implement this year. during the pandemic. Share of doctors, share of data, share of medicines, share of assistance. I said, if Europe back then, 1952, would have had the clarity and, let's say, the willingness to share these competencies, probably the solution wouldn't have been this year, the immediate solution, just closing borders. The problem for me is that still in Europe, and you can tell me whether this is the case in the United States, I don't know the United States situation, but still in Europe, as soon as we have a crisis, as soon as we have a problem, first thinking is, let's move back to our national competencies, to our national institutions in order to resolve it. Let's mention, for example, the terrorist attack which took place in France 2 weeks ago. This fact shows that the Dublin system doesn't work because a failed asylum seeker enters Italy. He is requested by Italy to go back to the country of origin, and he moves to France. So the question is that the system doesn't work, and the rules as they are thought, they do not work. So they are the basic, for me, the basic of the problems, and the European institutions are not taking these issues on their priority list in order to find the solutions. But immediately you have national politicians finding the solution as a reform and reinforcing their positions into these policies. As far as you say, difference between the first and the second lockdown. I think that as far as proportionality measures are concerned, I think that at least in France, the government has been much more careful. The first lockdown was kind of extreme. And there was no proportionality as far as the measures were concerned. You might know that Conseil d'État delivered several decisions pointing out, especially this element of the measures, either crossing not the borders of the state, but the borders of the region, because that becomes another problem then, or putting masks. So that was a little bit the difference I can underline. During the first pandemic, there was no so much judicial control, whereas during the summer, beginning of autumn, the judicial institutions, they started to kind of function, to operate, and to react to the measures taken by the government. I might also say that the European Court of Human Rights has been active throughout the first wave already, and we've had two interim decisions taken. Once concerning, and this is interesting as far as the link between Europe and United States is concerned, because there is a case against the United Kingdom where the applicant has to be removed to the United States, and the second asked by the court is whether the conditions where the applicant will be held upon removal in the United States are COVID compliant. So he will have kind of acceptable COVID treatment. And the second one concerns Greece, where the court has asked that the asylum seekers be accommodated in conditions which take care of their health conditions, especially in view of the COVID crisis. However, one point I wanted to underline from my previous intervention is that the COVID crisis poses an extreme tension in the European policies, health system, etc., especially as far as asylum seekers are concerned. There is a long line of more than 20 years of the jurisprudence of European courts related to persons who, because of medical conditions, cannot be removed to their countries of origin. The last case has been a Grand Chamber case in Strasbourg, Paposhvili versus Georgia. And then the debate was whether removing those applicants into the countries of origin, where the medical treatment conditions are not as good as in the European states, might lead to a violation of ill treatment, degrading treatment, and etc. Now the shift is huge under the COVID circumstances, because European Union states might say, hey, look, we are not able to test our own citizens and to treat as we should our own citizens, lack of capacities, COVID expansion, and etc. So how are we supposed to accept, test, and treat persons coming from abroad? And this is a huge debate already in some fora taking place in that regard, which I'm afraid will increase the tension. I'm sorry I spoke too long.
Can I interject something? Yeah, thanks. Well, first, Laura, you warned me too late about the word culture. I didn't go to MIT. I will point out, and I understand what you're saying, and I understand that a concept of culture can be used in ways that are unhelpful or even dangerous or oppressive. I get that. But in your discussion of why culture is a dangerous concept, it's centered around unacceptable culture. That's what you were describing. But that implies there's an acceptable culture. And I mean, we can come up with different terms for it. We can talk about manners, we can talk about habits, we can talk about ways of relating, but I think it's an inescapable concept. And I think this is one of the rocks over which the European Union has been stumbling for a while. I think that the euro crisis and the sovereign debt crisis has been as much a cultural crisis as anything else. Let me share just an anecdote with you. Some years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine at the University of Galway, Ireland, and he was the chairman of the French department there. And we were talking about the European Union. This is going way back. And he very much considered himself to be a European as much as an Irishman. But he made a remark that stuck with me, and we were talking about the progress of the EU, and he said, the difficulty is we just haven't quite figured out this culture thing. And I found that to be a remarkable statement as I've kind of, as I've thought about it over the years. In other words, he was addressing as if it were a problem of plumbing or sewage or something like that. I mean, to me, it's a little bit like saying, yes, we're getting married, but we haven't quite figured out this romantic sexual thing yet. I mean, culture is, or whatever word you need to use for it, is inextricably tied up. And I think that Nicholas put his finger on something that, at least from this point of view, in the U.S., we've been wondering about for a while, and that's the concept of the nation state, and the question of whether the nation state can be subordinated, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, simply in terms of order, to what extent the sovereignty of the nation state can be subordinated to the European Union project. I admire a great deal of what's going on in the EU, and time may tell, but our observation is that hasn't happened yet. And one of the things that terrorist attacks and now the pandemic have done is it tends to, once again, I think, accentuate the role of the nation state. And if I understood what Letty was saying, is there are, in terms of the concept of subsidiarity, there are some things that the EU is not yet prepared to do, or is not yet competent to do. It's a question not so much of theory, not so much of ideology, but a pragmatic question. None of that is meant as a, by no means a criticism of the European Union, but I think sometimes from this side of the Atlantic, we wonder if the EU has sufficient self-awareness at this particular point in time in order to continue to progress, or if it has a workable understanding of the limits of the European Union at this particular point in time. If I could add one thing to that, and I apologize, but in the Federalist Papers, the last of the Federalist Papers, 85, that were written to argue for our own Constitution, Alexander Hamilton quotes a European, Scottish philosopher, a Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, David Hume. And he says, we can't keep trying to make this thing perfect. He says, there comes a point in which there are three things that have to kick in. And one of those is experience, and one of those is time, and one of those is what he calls considerations of inconvenience, by which he meant trial and error. And so I think the primary thing that I find it interesting at this point in time is the European Union understanding that advice from one of your own, even if it's over 2 centuries ago, or is the European Union at this point doomed to sort of go from frustration to frustration? And if the COVID crisis demands some retraction of the momentum, the progress of the EU, I certainly don't see that as a failure. I see that as a kind of an adaptation or an evolution, or learning by trial and error.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Another question, like you see this evening, drawing on some theoretical reflections first. Another very common issue or theoretical idea when it comes to European policy making is the notion of multi-level governance, where we usually have this idea of actors from different vertical institutional levels work together on policy fields, and then at the same time it's combined with a horizontal cooperation. That means cooperation between civil society, economic actors, public actors, etc. And that's what many academics find as a normal government mode or governance mode when it comes to many policy fields. Now, looking at the two crisis situations, the COVID and the migration challenges, it seems that these governance, multi-level governance mechanisms have been in a way disturbed or have expressed themselves in a different way. What is your observation? Or how would be your interpretation? Is that the case? Was that different, or in which way was this different to, I would call it, business as usual cooperation in a multi-level governance perspective? And what were the drivers? Why was that different? Especially maybe also highlighting the horizontal dimension. This, at least in European border areas, we could say there was no integration of a civil society. It was a purely closing shop of a public, monolithic action of a state. So much of the achievements that we usually know from multi-level governance in all the policy spheres were fading away. So would you share this observation, and what would be explanatory factors for that? I would give this question to all of the panelists. I don't know who's motivated, maybe Niklas again. Starting.
You want to keep the order? Sure, I can give it a shot. I mean, yeah, that's a complex question that I think we would need to look into based on examples, right? So I think there are areas in which the idea of horizontal cooperation that you described never was so horizontal, insofar as it also kind of hid forms of externalizing and privatizing state functions to what was called civil society actors. We can also describe this as an NGOization of the welfare state. So, I'm more skeptical about the role of the involvement of so-called civil society organizations. In many cases, this presupposed horizontalism is actually a form of outsourcing and to some extent a laboratory for a reduction of state functions. So that we should be very careful about. And I think that's something that we see in the COVID crisis and the migration management regime or border regime in a type of overlapping way. So some of the students' presentations touched upon it, the involvement of NGOs in Greek refugee camps is not just a matter of, helping in charitable aid and so on. It also is a matter of replacing the absence of state function. So that is a sort of a caveat I want to put to this. So but then I also want to give it maybe a more positive twist, which is to say there are some areas in which I think actually that this sort of subsidiarity principle has functioned quite well and has shown some resilience. And I think that's, without giving too much credit to the German government, I think that there's some lessons to be learned in the comparison between Germany and France on this particular point. So both in terms of COVID and in terms of migration management. I think in terms of COVID, we see that the principle of the municipal authorities, in the strength of municipal authorities in Germany is really something to look at more closely. So municipal authorities have been absolutely central in Germany in order to track clusters of COVID, but also in order to arrange a more humane and more functional way of guaranteeing housing for migrants. And so I think that's something that speaks to the numbers that are so diverging between the French and I was based in Paris before, so I saw also what Lady Bianco described as this disproportionate lockdown. I mean, that's just something that is also, in my opinion, a result of the absence of municipal management in terms of tracing clusters, in terms of having a closeness of governance to the citizens. And so this is one level, but then on the level of sort of civil society involvement, I think that this municipal dimension and this multi-layeredness, that's something that I think is quite interesting. And I want to mention this so-called Seebrücke movement, the Sea Bridge movement, which is a movement both of civil society groups and municipal governments. And over 100 cities, municipal governments in Germany have signed up on this, which is to declare their city a safe haven for migrants. It's similar to the sanctuary movement in the United States, and I think the sanctuary movement is also something that's crucial to be imagining the type of migration solidarity beyond the framework of the nation state. So what you described as sort of a multi-layered approach is not just a matter of having different types of institutional responses, but it's also to sort of link civil society involvement with other institutional arenas. And I think the arena of the city is absolutely crucial. The safe city. You can have a president of the United States that says we don't want any migrants, but if the city of Chicago, for instance, says migrants are welcome, refugees are welcome here, then I don't think the left would do so badly in reappropriating this otherwise rather right-wing heritage of decentralized government, of state rights, and so on. And I think this type of language is something that we should be looking at more closely, both in the case of German cities, but also in American sanctuaries.
Thank you.
If I could add, I would add to that. I agree and echo what Nicolas said about horizontalism effectively outsourcing government functions. To look at this, to offer some American context to this too, I would point out that in the United States, one of the major dividing lines between the right and the left right now, and for much of I would say the past 40 years, has been, is there a role for government in civil society? Thinking back to Ronald Reagan said, government isn't a solution to the problems, government is the problem itself. And that is a major narrative and talking point on the political right, is less government is better government. And we have major political movements in the United States that deny the necessity of government in the first place. Thinking about the part part of the country, part of the state of Georgia, where I live in central Georgia. I'm also reminded that of Robert Putnam's argument, I think in his 1995 book on bowling alone, that we've also seen a collapsing sense of civitas, of civic connection, of social cohesion. And political scientists, better than we historians, measure these things about elements or indicators of civic health. And what we have seen concurrently with those past 40 years of doubting the role that government should play in civil society is an increased, or I should say decreasing trust in public institutions, decreased trust in schools, in the media, in newspapers, and so forth. So horizontalism, or the idea that other elements of civil society can take on some of the burden of governance, is a theoretical exercise that doesn't necessarily work universally in practice. The second point that I'd like to make is that maybe making a comparison between the United States and the European Union. That said, I believe that the United States has been more successful in its exercises in federalism than the European Union has been. I think that what we are seeing in the European Union now are some of the difficulties and the challenges of adapting to federalism that the United States worked out with a lot of difficulty in the years of the early republic. Hank is far more specialist on that and can speak to that.
Yeah, but is there someone else who wanted to speak first? I think that this is a very interesting question, and I think the way Nicholas framed it is very helpful, and also the contrast that you are seeing from one country to another, and exactly how levels of government are working together, and which levels of government might be responsible for this or that. I spent a fair amount of time in Spain, and I have a lot of colleagues there, and this has been a real issue there. I mean, who has the authority to do what, and who can the Premier of Catalonia shut down the entire autonomous region, or is that a national thing? And then even within, can the mayor of Madrid shut down Madrid? Do they have that authority? And I think Harold made some good points. One of them I'll pick up on quickly. That is the role of government. I mean, we're seeing an unprecedented exercise of power by the government in shutting down private businesses, which has already been to the ruin of many small businesses. And so questions have arisen about where exactly that authority comes from. In terms of how well our federal system has worked, I might tend to disagree a bit with Harold on that. I don't think it's worked real well during the COVID crisis. Now, some of that is undoubtedly attributable to leadership. Who can make us wear a mask? Does the president have the authority to require citizens to wear a mask? If so, it's going to take a little bit of constitutional jurisprudence to figure out where that authority might come from. So our biggest division, of course, is between the state and the federal level, to which, in some measure, the European country to superstate structure has been analogous. Our political history is such that the national government has taken more and more power from the states. However, the states still lay claim, by virtue of the 10th Amendment, to three distinct areas, among more areas. One of those is education, although these are the traditional areas of state powers: education, law enforcement, and then what's called police power. law enforcement and police power may sound like they're the same thing. Now, on all three of those areas, there have been incursions by the federal government, but probably less so in the area of police power. Police power refers to dealing with health issues, dealing with pandemics. And so there has been confusion about what the national government can do, what the CDC can do, and what the states should be doing. I'm not sure the CDC, Centers for Disease Control Atlanta, I'm not sure that even they have the authority to make everyone wear a mask. CDC, normally, if they're going to exercise that kind of police power, they might restrain one or two people from entering the country, say from another country that's suffering from Ebola or something like that. Strictly speaking, it should be the states that are imposing the various restrictions. And to some measure, that's what's going on. But it's been fairly confused, and it continues to be confused. And I don't think Washington has helped that. But I think that Joe Biden coming to office has got a real challenge on his hands to help set the boundaries of where that authority is going to come from. At the very least, well, and that's just not something that Trump did a good job with for several different reasons. But my only point is, maybe in some areas we are an example in the way that we've handled the divisions of government, as Harold suggests, but don't look at us right now until we get this pandemic thing figured out, because it appears to me that our footing is not real sure right now.
Thank you. Laura, Lady, would you like to add something?
Just very briefly, my very first comment at the beginning of the hour here was about the loss of multi-level governance in Argentina. So I think it's absolutely happening. And again, it's the word crisis that has allowed for these kind of different layers and different sets of actors to weigh in. But it's what's still outstanding, and I know we have somebody on here from Brazil as well. I'd be interested to hear about what's happening in Brazil. What's not clear to me is how long this will last. That is how given that a crisis is a short moment in time by definition, once this extends longer, whether they'll be able to hold on to this kind of crisis mentality is not clear. Then that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Lady, do you want to add something? Could you put on your micro, please?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. My reaction to all these debates and the efforts to contain the crisis, but also to resolve the crisis, I see two different kind of instruments and solutions proposed. When it deals with containing the crisis, limiting the number of infections, the government moved immediately to rather extreme measures. On the other side, there is a completely different kind of approach, and we are now at the stage of really assessing it, because for finding the vaccines, so the solution to the crisis, the governments have very much gone towards the private enterprises, initiatives, universities, and etc. So you see a different approach in this kind of containment. Government intervenes immediately, limiting the rights of citizens to move, to go out, and etc., without any kind of consultation, without any kind of preparation. Especially as far as the second wave is concerned, there was no such a kind of preparation, because we might accept that the first one was kind of there, everybody was unprepared. But when it deals with resolving the crisis, finding the remedies in the long term, there you can see there is a much better cooperation and consultation with civil society and universities.
Thank you, but I'm wondering if this is not finally referring to a much profounder problem, which is quite interesting maybe to reflect on. Aren't these non-linear, dynamic policy challenges, whereas our political system is more or less very linear? And couldn't we interpret all these reactions, which are not very coherent, very logical, as an inability of a political administrative system, our logical, linear way of handling issues, compared to the challenges of dynamic and non-linear issues? Could you share this interpretation, or is that too too academic or too strange from my point of view? No, but, I mean, we attempt to, or what we should bring up as a public institution is a realistic, rational response from the state to a problem that we have identified. And I very much like the students' paper on evidence. That is that difficulty on evidence-based policy making. If you look at the politicians, we have a broad debate on how big the problem is, on the magnitude of the problem. So that is a very interesting issue, I think, that we have difficulties in handling and understanding the problems we were talking about. Don't know if somebody would like to comment on this. Comment.
I mean, I would just say, you know, if you put it into a certain abstract level of reflection, then we will all agree that, you know, the legal system is a more linear type of slow-moving system of social relations, and then the area of policy making is a much more dynamic, punctual, non-linear type of domain. But, you know, what type of conclusion are we going to draw from this normatively? And I just think that it's not necessarily desirable for policy, or even the politics more generally, by which you can include the state, but also, importantly, in a democratic society, citizens. You know, to even conceive of politics as a matter of control, as a matter of getting a hold of things, as a matter of managing. And I think that what people in the type of era of populist movements on the left and the right feel is precisely that they're being managed, they're being responded to in the language of management. So maybe paradoxically, the very desire to get more evidence-based policy is just going to reinforce, to the frustration of the political left, the type of populist backlash from the right that says, that's exactly not the problem. We don't want evidence. We don't want to be talked to, you know, like normal human beings. We don't want to be managed. We want to be citizens. We want to be proud. We want these other more, as Professor Edmondson likes to put it, cultural dimensions. And so, you know, I'm a bit skeptical. So on that score. And then on another level, there's also the idea that was brought up in the students' discussion about data. And so I do see a risk, a type of serious risk for democratic forms of collective self-organization, the way we organize our society of citizens. And by citizens, I don't mean citizens who just have a passport, but potentially also acting as citizens with people who are deprived of citizenship in a legal way, right? Acting in a community of people who are together in a community, like, for example, a neighborhood of Berlin. How are we going to do this? If politics is reduced to a matter of data gathering, is reduced to a matter of biopolitical, you know, basically inscription, where you are going to take the fever as soon as you cross the border, and then it enters into some sort of semi-transparent, or in any case technocratic system of data collection. I think that there we have real challenges. Where I'm not so sure that the better, more evidence, more scientific type of response is necessarily going to be the more democratic one. And I think that what we need to be aware of is that this type of like instrumental logic of state policy might in fact generate a type of backlash if the right is the only place where citizens have a type of opportunity to act politically. You know, and so I'm very cautious of this like managerial instrumental logic, and I think we should question it to some extent.
Okay, thank you, Laura. I think you'd like to comment on that.
I just want to make sure that we're clear when we're talking about data, Niklas. Were you responding to the student question about the data gathering? Because I think
Right, I understand that data gathering is a very large term where we can count COVID cases and so on, but where does it lead, and where does the imperative of data?
And that was, I thought that was his point, which is if you're not gathering data on COVID cases among the migrant community, among the refugee community, then you're showing that you don't really care about them. I think that was what his point was, but maybe he that is.
I'm just saying that gathering data can also be a way of not caring, because it's a way of controlling.
Okay, yeah, I hear you. On the other hand, a case, for example, in Latin America, historically, until just a few years ago, no data was gathered on the nationality of migrants coming into countries. The majority were always Latin American, so Peruvians always went to Chile and Paraguayans always went to Argentina. But suddenly, about 5-10 years ago, it became clear that there are large numbers of Africans and Indian people arriving on Latin America's border with the visa or even just arriving, and there was no documentation. And I think that says something about the values of a state. I'm talking about something different probably. I do think data gathering does say a lot about how states perceive a question. I don't think we're disagreeing.
No. Now, there is a question from the audience, and Birte would like to raise the question.
Yeah, I read you the question, which is not only referring to Europe, actually, but the examples from Europe, how migrants were integrated to the labor force during this pandemic, like in Germany, that they were working in agriculture while borders were closed. So what is your opinion of migrants as a part of the labor force during the pandemic? Volunteers or refugees with a medical degree, etc.
Does anyone want to answer the question? It was an important question in certain part of Europe, at least. It's also quite an interesting question linked with the discovery of a vaccine in Germany by Turkish migrants. So how would do you have any comment on the question? No comments?
So I can give.
Yes.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we do.
I can give just a legal answer, because such situations have come also before the courts, and we have a Greek case on 2017, I believe, where the migrants were employed in Greece camps of strawberries. And the situation was that the owners of these camps basically forced these migrants to work on these camps, and the situation was so grave that the court found a very substantial violation of the Convention of Article 4 of the Convention, forced labor. So this brings to a very delicate situation that, okay, they might contribute into the labor force in different countries, but also this is linked with the issue of regularization of their status, contributions, and etc. Because Fred is saying that, okay, the Turkish couple that found the vaccine was of Turkish origin, but they're well established in Germany. So this shows that when there is given a proper possibility also to migrants, we might have such beautiful solutions for the entire world. But the question is that there have to be rules there, and how to regularize these the situation of migrant workers.
Henk.
It's a very interesting question. I can give a little glimpse from our point of view and our experience. First of all, we're really dependent on migrant labor in agriculture along our southern border. When people say that migrants take undocumented workers, when they say that they take work away from Americans, that really isn't true. These are jobs that need to be done, and they're only being done by migrant willing to undertake that. And to be sure, there's a lot of agriculture that's especially time sensitive, like oranges and in Florida, strawberries in California, that are facing and have been for several months facing their own crisis because the flow of migrant workers has not been coming into the U.S. As it normally does. It's trickled to almost a stop. That's a little bit different from what the student was asking, but the question of migration, labor, and COVID is a very important one. And the question of migration, immigration, and labor is one that has not been given attention as it should have been over the last 4 years in our country.
Niklas, yes.
I'm in full agreement with that characterization, and I think that the political economic dimension is sort of the elephant in the room. I think that we need to think more seriously about how the European Union, both understood as sort of a supranational actor, but also the individual national governments, how they act because of economic imperatives and sort of the strategic political economic understanding. So it's definitely a fact that the European Union, irregardless of its efforts to regularize and to some extent formalize its border regime, does rely at the same time, paradoxically, on a sort of like permanent underclass of non-regular, undocumented labor. So we have this sort of like permanent paradox of at the same time trying to formalize while continually relying for the continuation of, for example, the French economic system on a massive population of undocumented immigrants. The French government specifically has not done much, in fact, has acted against regularization efforts by a very strong movement of undocumented migrants that's also connected to the labor movement in a particular way, and that is also, really speaking as workers. And I think that's really important to take into consideration. And some of the industries that are hardest hit by COVID are also those industries that have the largest proportion of foreign-born workers. So the hospitality industry, for instance, by which it's a funny name to some extent in this context, or an ironic one, the tourism industry more aptly. According to the recent OECD study, a quarter of people working in that field in the European Union are foreign-born, which is to say non-European. So I think that's a real, and that of course that industry is heavily impacted by COVID. Similar to agriculture, so both the industries that are suffering economically and have experiencing shrinking rates of economic activity due to COVID, but then also essential workers, which are out there, continuing while other people, are in the home office. So I think I'm very much concerned with the creation of a type of permanent underclass. On the one hand, we have those who are citizens and who are doing the home office, and on the other hand, there are those who are non-citizens and who are doing essential work and continue to engage in activities that expose them disproportionately to getting COVID. And I think that is something that where we can say that to say that in the United States, President Trump has acted clumsily, as was said earlier, I think is really an understatement. I think what we see there is really a structural type of reliance on a racialized and oftentimes non-citizen underclass of basically essential workers to be declared to be essential. And in Europe, we see the same to some extent, even though the European Union likes to some extent not mention this issue, but we have it too. And in France, undocumented migrants, if you order Uber Eats, chances are the delivery is coming from someone who's robbed of formal status. And I think that is just a structural phenomenon that really needs to be discussed in the way that political economy and issues of citizenship and non-citizenship are closely tied to each other. And that becomes more accentuated during COVID.
And just a point to bring up that we've all walked around a little bit. Many of these migrants are fearful. So they're fearful of if they don't work, that they'll, when they continue to work, that they'll get COVID. But if they don't work, they'll get found to be illegal. There's a real, at least in the United States, there's a real element of fear here that has to be acknowledged. It was a great question, whoever posed it.
And one other thing to add on that note too, in the United States, most people receive their health care through their employment. Mm-hmm. So if you're employed, sort of off books, people don't necessarily have reliable access to health care. So of course it has exacerbated a public health crisis because, for people who are undocumented, they don't have that reliable access to health care, whether to treat COVID or any other sort of illness.
Thank you. We're nearly running out of time, so I would just like to have a little feedback on one last question. If I may ask you maybe to sum up, what are the main lessons learned now, looking at the two cases, migration and COVID? What do we have to change before facing the next challenges of this magnitude in order to avoid turning them into a situation of a so-called crisis? Maybe a short little resume from each of you. Thank you. I don't know who would like to start. It's Niklas again.
Niklas is always the first.
Can you repeat the question for me? I'm so sorry. Can you repeat it again?
So what would be your lessons learned when we look at the two cases, COVID and migration? What should we do in order to avoid them to become a crisis situation if we are faced one day with new challenges at that kind of magnitude? So it's still Niklas.
I think that certainly there are some lessons learned in terms of the element, like basically what we cannot get rid of in the situation is the sense of contingency. Things can be otherwise. At the beginning of the crisis, when people went into lockdown for the first time, I think that's actually a moment where people not only had a sense of fear, a sense of catastrophe, but a sense of type of disturbed certainties, which is at the same time a violent moment, a moment in which lives have been at stake and continue to be exposed in ways that make populations vulnerable to these overlapping risks of COVID and of border regimes. However, what it also shows is that there is a sense of contingency, of a sense of a type of history that has sort of like run out of control. The old answers no longer hold. And we see a type of, disarray on the level of sort of policymakers. We see a type of, loss of understanding on the level of old academic type of patterns of explanation. And I think that might be, for all of its, violent aspects, also be a moment sort of reckoning and a moment of attending to the sort of inherently contingent nature of political arrangements. We can do things otherwise. There is an opportunity for radical change either way. And I think this sense of sort of history that has opened up, both as sort of like this abysmal type of opening of crisis, but also this more hopeful dimension of things can go otherwise. Things go out, people go out in the middle of the street, as Laura was mentioning earlier, all summer for Black Lives Matter, in the middle of a pandemic, wearing masks, keeping a distance, being in solidarity by keeping a distance. And so we have new forms of understanding how a society can be transformed that come out of this moment as well. And so I think what we cannot afford is to fall into a type of pessimism about it. And what we also cannot afford is to sort of stick to our old categories. So I think one of the ways that in a more practical institutional response I personally think that we really need to reconsider the importance of municipal authorities and the way in which we can reimagine both the city of sanctuary, but also a type of like a close civic sense of, solidarity-based, but also governmentally sustained health authorities. And so that is far from a radical agenda. That is something that is practiced by some of the German cities. That's something that happens by American sanctuary cities. And I think that's going to be something that continues to be important for the road ahead, whether Trump is president or Biden, or whether, Angela Merkel is chancellor or someone else. Or, and for that matter, Marine Le Pen elected president of France, which is not out of the question. So I think this decentralization is going to be crucial for the progressive imaginary. And I think that's sort of a lesson that we can take from both, and that should alert us to the ways we can act not in solidarity, not in terms of like hierarchical charity of welcoming, but in a more profound solidarity with migrants as political actors, as people with agency. And I think that only happens on the local level, and so that's where we have to start.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lady, any comments on what kind of lessons can be learned from these multiple crises? Or Hank, because I don't think Lady is still connecting, but Hank, please come in.
Okay. Either he's not connecting or he is very attentively listening. Just trying to state this briefly. I think the question began if we should face another crisis like this. I think there's no question that we will. I think it's just a matter of time before the next pandemic hits. Ease of transportation has become our enemy, especially flight. So we really do need to learn lessons. That'd be my first point. Number two, at least it goes back to something we've discussed several times, but at least here, we need to be clear about the roles of the national government, state government, and the local government. There's been too much confusion over that, a question of federalism. Number three, I think we need to ask how well lockdowns work, and especially given the economic consequences of that. Again, referring to Spain, Spain was hit harder than most European countries, and they had severe lockdowns. I was corresponding with friends out there and asking my friend, the abogado, a lawyer, and I was asking him, how soon can you go out to play again? Because they were stuck in their apartments for weeks on end, and now Spain is being hit again, perhaps just as severely. So I think the concept, the practice of lockdowns needs to be considered, and here they've been inconsistently applied. Nicholas was, I think you were kind of romanticizing some of our protests. There was not a lot of social distancing going on in a lot of those gatherings, and there wasn't as much criticism or of the public health considerations, and I think there was far more spread of the disease at those gatherings than many wanted to admit. I'm not saying they shouldn't have protests. I'm just saying there is a lot of frustration over here about the inconsistent application of lockdowns. And then finally, I think we're hoping the medical science learns something. It's taken a while to figure this thing out. I know the mortality rate is going down, but there's still a lot that is not known. The disease is not respiratory, but it has significant vascular consequences. And to make it even more mysterious, those of us who have O positive blood, I do, and my wife does, we don't seem to get hit as hard by the virus. We've both had it, and it was comparatively mild, whereas other people my own age, younger, have been, for example, my physician, very, very sick and he didn't go into the hospital. So there's a lot to learn from medical science, and hopefully that can be applied the next time. And yes, I am willing to provide some of my blood. I'm putting it up on eBay, and just let me know if you don't have O positive.
Laura?
I don't have anything profound to say at all, unlike my two previous comments. But I just want to point out that in this last crisis, the movement of people was immediately, and this is obvious, movement of people was immediately blocked based on nationality, based on borders. Japanese were flown out of cruise ships and sent back, and the Canadians went after their own people. It was a highly nationalist reaction to the virus. And I just would say, I was really disappointed and surprised that Canadians would go in and pick up only their own people and leave the others aboard a cruise ship. So I'm hoping that maybe the next time we think outside of borders when we have these kinds of epidemics or pandemics. Again, I don't have any big solutions. I don't think that decentralization is our answer, but because Vietnam and did a great job, highly centralized, but didn't have an issue of border movements of people. That's all I have to say.
Lady
or
yeah, do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Apparently you are connected again.
No, I was cut. I had a problem with the computer, so I got through my iPhone.
Good.
My reaction. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the other intervenants in the final panel, and I hope I'm not going to repeat anything that was said. My reaction is that I think our institutions, all of them at local, state, and international level, were unprepared to confront a crisis such as COVID. And I think, in addition, they were unprepared also to face crises we had early warning on, such as migrants crisis, and they let these phenomenon develop into a crisis for years, and this becomes a crisis only when the situation is so bad that they need to take very urgent and grave decisions, I would say, especially looking from the point of view of human rights and even rule of law, at the very last moment. For me, for European states and for US to take as granted the response to COVID crisis, the Chinese solution, there is a problem. Immediately, the European states should have reacted when the crisis started when the virus started to develop in China. December, January, February, well, we're kind of fine with that because we're hoping that this is going to stay outside our borders. But no contingency plans, no preparations, nothing, and then we found ourselves into the Chinese solution of the Chinese answer to the crisis. So that I find unfortunate. I very much, because I managed to hear so much from Niklas, I very much agree with him when he says that we should take care of the local solutions. And I think there is a way now to combine European coordination and cooperation with another principle of European integration, which is the subsidiarity, and this kind of cooperation should also take into account the needs of the special areas in Europe, also when confronted both with COVID crisis but also with migrants crisis and with combination of the two. So this is my reaction, and I'm sorry again for the connection.
Thank you, Lady. Harold, do you want to conclude? You have to put your microphone on because we don't hear you. Thank you.
My apologies. Thoughts. The first is one is on the role of government. We have many students in this discussion right now, and those of us who teach about these things have always believed it, and now you all are getting to see it in real time, and it is how intricately interconnected all the elements of our society are. So none of us, I think will ever look at a grammar school teacher the same way again if we've had our children sitting at the dining room table teaching them. And I will add on a personal note, there's nothing quite so humbling as not being able to do a 5-year-old's homework. So it is the intricate interconnection of the elements of society in good ways and in bad ways that we have seen. My hope is that we will emerge from this crisis with a more sophisticated popular understanding of how, say, housing policy and income inequality and education and workforce development, how those things are connected and how they play together. Likewise, how do the public and the private and the nonprofit sectors work together? On that note as well, I will say that a crisis can be made better or worse by the government's response. And something that we have seen around the world, governments, I think in many ways, when this was unfolding in the spring, reacted, I think, in ways that are, and I'm going to use that freighted phrase, that seemed true to their political culture. In the United States, it was in many ways for us to defer to the judgment of the states, to decentralize our approach. So I would say that perhaps the heightened sense of awareness will lead us to put more pressure on our governments to have a better response to these sorts of events. And then the last thing that I will say is, as we come to understand more about the COVID-19 crisis, I believe quite strongly that we will understand that it has its roots in humankind's over-exploitation of the natural environment. Somehow, in the interplay between the natural environment and the humankind. And I think that in our lifetimes, or students on this call, certainly in your lifetimes, we're going to see massive migration in the world that is caused by drought, by climate change, by pandemic. And in many ways, this gives us an opportunity to understand a bit more about what we might see in the century to come. So I would leave you with that also as a parting thought, that there's an opportunity for us all to analyze and to learn.
Thank you, and thank you for giving us also optimistic food for thought, because I think it's also something important in this time of very, let's say, pessimistic approach of the many crises or so-called crises we have described. So thank you very much, and many new subjects for next roundtable. And I think that Birte will conclude this roundtable.
I have to keep the social distancing, and still you can't see me.
Your hand back.
Yeah. Sorry.
You have collateral damage.
Well, thank you very much for this really interesting debate. It was very challenging. because we were trying to kind of link two subjects, the migration, the COVID crisis. When I organized the first Castle talk on the migration crisis, the COVID crisis was not yet there. So this was an opportunity to link the two. I think it was very, very interesting and also very instructive in terms of comparison between Europe and the United States. I would like to take the opportunity to thank also two people who are not visible, but I know that they are online, Harold and Uli Leibrecht, who both, yes, thank you so much, because they actually facilitate and enable us to organize these exchanges between students and experts, professors, professionals on current challenges in international relations. And I think it's excellent. I think both the students and the professors, we take so much out of these conversations, and let's continue to do them. This is my first online experience of the Castle Talks. It wasn't so bad, I think. Didn't have any major problems. And so, well, the follow-up with the students will take place on the 18th of January, but I do still hope that one time the pandemic is over and that I can invite also all the American friends to come back to the Chateau and be there en présentiel, and also our new partner from Reims, because there is something more into it when you can actually debate en présentiel. So thanks again. Thanks for your time. Thanks for all the efforts, and hopefully meet you soon again.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.